Okay. So who's going to be in charge of the minions? See?
I'll find the appropriate.
Okay. I'm going to start the learning sponsors, and then we'll get right into the Gemara. A year of learning, friends of Melaskotsky, Moshe Zelig ben Mordechai, Martin Lippman and family in memory of his wife, Malka Chana Bat Pinchas, friends of Herb Jeremiah, Tzvi ben Zev, friends of Sam Coleman, Shmuel ben Yaakov, friends of Gideon Lazinski, Mordechai Shlomo ben Meir, Bella and David Adler in memory of her father, Eliyahu ben Yosef, a Kohen, those who were inspired by our Rebbetzin Emerita, Sheila Shapiro, Sarah Esther Malka Bat Meshulam Yisachar. Gail and Leslie Kaplan in memory of their parents, Mushka Sprinza Bat Yosef Chaim Bachava, Chanan ben Moshe Eliezer Vachana, Pesha Bat Shmuel Yitzchak Halevi B'tzipora, Isser ben Yoel Moshe HaKohen Vachan. Rexford Friends of Gladys Sherman, Gutta Bat Meir, Michael Klein and friends of Judah Klein, Yehuda Tzvi ben Chaim, Marsha Brana in memory of her husband, Harav Yerachmeel ben Shmuel. A month of learning by Reuven and Susan Podolsky in memory of his father, Tzvi ben Pinchas. A week of learning by Ari and Judy Cohen in memory of his mother, Fega bat Yechiel, and her mother, Hinda bat Moshe Zechariah Halevi. Michael and Sharon Glass in memory of his father, Yitzchak Tzvi ben Yechiel Michal. Today being the 19th, we have a day of learning by Lala and Siggy Bessler in memory of her mother, Brendel Bat Yechiel, and by Rena and Alan Mosak. Okay, in memory of her mother, Sarah Shoshana Bat Yechezkel, and also by Kate and Saul Goldstein, in memory of her mother, Rivka Bat Shlomo Dov. Shemas have an Ariya, Crank Rafia, Velti Yeshua Shema Talia, V'chol B'nai Israel, a good Gebenshja.
Amen.
Okay. Today's daf is Samach Zion. Just a reminder that we will be finishing Kedushin 2 weeks from tomorrow. Okay? So we will.
Have we decided on the CM yet?
There wasn't a final decision. Okay? Suggestion by Michael was that he pick up, bagels and stuff, schmears and stuff like that, that morning, because the daf is not, the remaining amudim are not from the shortest, shall we say, right? Yeah. Okay. Actually, today's is one of the shortest amudim, of the shortest daf. Okay. I want to go back, really have a start on bottom of Samach Vav Amud Beis 66b, the Gemara. But to do so, I want to quickly review the Mishnah. Okay. Mel is not here this morning.
No. You have to get his ears.
Doctor's appointment. Okay, I didn't see him. Okay. So the Mishnah, remember, talked about the fact about what I'll call family yichus, in terms of defining by whose standard we determine the progeny based on, okay, whether it's through the father or through the mother. Okay? And the Mishnah identified a number of examples, okay, in which I was going to put it in, trying to succinctly, both in terms of the appropriate Jewish marriage and an appropriate non-Jewish marriage. Okay, general
appropriate non-Jewish marriage.
Right. In other words, non-Jews marrying non-Jews. Okay, right. Okay, the pattern was through the father. Okay, right. I'm sort of combining. Okay, when it was a question of an inappropriate marriage. Okay, which meant it's possible that the marriage was prohibited by an assay or a lav. Okay, then we saw that the Mishnah told us that the progeny was determined by the pagum, the lesser valid individual. Okay, and we also saw, okay, that there were other situations in the last part of the Mishnah, okay, where there was such a situation where the where the yichus of the child was based on the mother. Okay, so the Gemara wants to clarify again these situations and why we had to have 4 different statements there throughout the Mishnah. Okay, so kol makom sheyesh kiddushin. Okay, our Mishnah uses the phrase kol makom sheyesh kiddushin. Now, is that a cloud? Is that a general statement? If it's a general statement, does that seem to imply all of the examples given are fine? Or are we going to say, no, it's not a general statement, because in each case of the Mishnah, after it said kol makom, etc., then it said a statement ve'eza zo. Okay, in other words, spelling it out. So maybe we have here a klal uprat. Okay, and therefore the examples given are not all of the examples that follow in that general statement. Maybe we're going to find that there are examples of certain kinds of kiddushin, okay, where the Mishnah does not spell them out. And therefore we have to ask the questions as to why then this was not spelled out explicitly in the Mishnah, but instead, okay, maybe we have this situation where we have, again, klal, a general statement that lists some examples, okay, but is spelled out explicitly in terms of the ezazo part of the statement in the Mishnah that says, and these are the specifics, but we haven't given all of the examples that would fit in that category. Okay, so let's see what happens. Gemara kol makom sheyesh kiddushin. Our Mishnah said every place where there is, okay, I'm going to use the word for the moment, valid betrothal. Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben, all right, Shimon le Rabbi Yochanan. He says klalahu, that this seems to be a general statement. Okay, the kol makom yesh kiddushin ve'ein avira, and then citing the Mishnah because it says every place where there is valid betrothal and there is no sin involved. Havlad holech achar hazachar. Do we say really in every place that's the case? If it's a klal, have we given all the examples? All right. So the Gemara picks up then and says, wait a second. All right. Okay. In other words, are we including everything or are there certain things being excluded? Okay. Our Gemara tells us today's daf. What about the example of the following? Gershon samam zeret. Okay. A convert that marries a woman, okay, who is a mamzeret. Okay, what about that example? The yesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, because we have there valid kiddushin, but there is no clear sin involved in that situation. Okay, exactly. Right? Havlad holech achar hapagum. There it said, okay, that the vlad, the yichus of the progeny follows the one that is not appropriate, the lesser one, the inferior one. Titania, as we learn as follows, Ger shenasa mamzeret, havlad mamzer. Why? Because there we learn in a Braita that the convert who marries a mamzeret, the progeny is considered the a mamzer. Divrei Rabbi Yossi. That's the view of Rabbi Yossi. So what happens? Amarle. So he said to them, Mi savarat matnitin Rabbi Yossi. Do you consider that the author or editor of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi? Matnitin Rabbi Yehuda. No, our Mishnah follows the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Damar, who says, Ger lo yisamam zeret. Okay, where he says, no, a ger should not marry a mamzer. Okay, so the question here, I'm going to pause for a moment, is basically, is a ger considered part of Kahal Hashem? That is the essence of the question there. Some will say, some held yes, some held no. Okay, Gemara is not going to go into that question in detail, but
Who held no? A ger is a regular Jew.
Not
Okay.
necessarily.
okay, the question
There's
is,
a conversion too.
okay, the question, well, I'm not going to get into that at the moment, but I'm going to say what the implication is, the difference between kadosh, being born as a Jew, being versus, okay, somebody who becomes a Jew through choice, because the implication is the ger is one.
The Torah clearly says that Torah achas leger or the Kol
Right.
Yisrael.
But that's
There's
but,
one law
right,
for both.
but that is the part of the underlying question of the Gemara. Is the does the who considers the ger part of Kahal Yisrael or not? Okay, so what happens? V'yesh kiddushin, v'yesh avira. What about the situation there, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that there is kiddushin and there is an avira there, right? By marrying the mamzeret, okay? Havlad holecha pagum, okay? And therefore, in that case, the child would be considered mamzer, right? So the Gemara challenges that, okay? As you just did, right? V'nitnaya. So let us teach it that way. Let us spell that out, and the Mishnah should say that, okay? But the problem is the Mishnah said what at the beginning? Kol, right?
No except
As if there were no exceptions, right? Tana, kol makom. Our Mishnah taught kol makom. Okay, that would seem to include this case. Okay, the seifa la atuye. Okay, and therefore later it would become to, okay, to exclude it. How do we exclude it? Because it only said ezezo. It's spelled out. So now that's arguing we didn't have a general statement, but we had a klal uprat. Klal uprat, ein beklal, elamasha beprat. That's the darasha. All right, so let's go on. V'bayatema. I might say, on the other hand, le'olam Rabbi Yossi, that maybe we can interpret our Mishnah as being edited or voiced by Rabbi Yossi. Why? Vatana. And it teaches Ezazo. The second part of each section spells out Ezazo, like it's saying a more specific variety. Lemaute. And that comes to exclude. Okay? So instead, we have a klal uprat situation. Ve'ezozo v'tulo. Are you saying then that excludes only that one example, okay, and no others? V'harei, I'm going to give you throw out another example. What about the following? Chalal shenasa bat Yisrael. What about that case? Diyesh kiddushin ve'ein avera. Because there too, we have an example of a valid kiddushin, okay? And there is no sin involved in that. But what happens? Havlad holech achar hazachar. In other words, we say there that the yichus of the progeny is such that that child becomes what? A male child? Okay.
Halal.
Okay. Does he become a halal?
No, a Kohen.
No.
If he marries a Yisrael, he becomes a Kohen.
Well, but it says achar hazachar, which would mean he becomes follows after his father,
Which is a halal.
which would seem to be a halal. Okay, but we know what's the case. Ha lo kasha. Wait a second. Maybe he should become a kohen. He didn't become halal. Okay, if that's not an aveira, that's sin, right? He should become a kohen, right? Ha lo kasha. Maybe we're going to say here that that's not a problem. Why? Ki Rabbi Dustai ben Rabbi Yehuda Svirale. Because maybe he holds like Rabbi Dustai ben Rabbi Yehuda, namely, V'harei Yisrael shenasa chalala. What about the situation of an Israelite who marries a chalala? The yesh kiddushin va'ein avera. In that situation, we say there is valid betrothal and no sin. Havlad ocher holech achar hazachar. That the child then, the yichus of the progeny, follows the male. Okay? In that case, so that child becomes a Yisrael, clearly, right? So maybe I should argue back to the other case that the child should become a Kohen and not a Halal, right? Tana, Kol Makom. Why? Because it taught in our Raita, our Mishnah, Kol Makom, the Resha, every place, okay, in our first part of the Mishnah. La Atuye. And maybe that comes to exclude it. So if that's the case, is the Gemara, V'nitnaya, so behedya, let us teach that example again explicitly. Mishum delo matne la, but it was the expression that they did not teach it. Why? Okay. Hechi nitne. Why didn't they sort of teach it? Okay. In other words, they were shortening, succinctly stating the mission. Kohenet, v'levia v'yisraelit v'chalala. Okay, so we've got now these examples, right? Sheni seif lekohen levi v'Yisrael. All right, if they marry a kohen or levi Yisrael, v'chalala lekohen michazia. Do we really say that a chalala married to kohen is suitable? Va'ika de Rava bar bar Chana. We've got the statement of Rabbi bar bar Chana, the Amar Rabbi bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni, Shenasa Mitzrit Rishona. We have a situation where we know, according to the Torah, that it has to be a third generation Mitzri that's allowed into Kahal Hashem, and not a first or second generation Mitzri. So what happens? In our situation, we have a second generation Egyptian that marries a first generation Egyptian. Let's assume for the moment that it's the male that's the second generation Egyptian. Does that mean that his progeny is going to be considered a third generation Egyptian and therefore able to enter Kahal Hashem? Or are we going to say in that example, no, that we're going to follow the mother and that that child is only going to be a second generation Egyptian and not able to enter Kahal Hashem? Okay? So what happens? We see Rabbi bar bar Chana is of the opinion, what? Bana shlishit hava, that her son is going to be considered a third generation Egyptian and therefore would be eligible. Okay, right? So in that case, in that particular example, it follows the father. So why shouldn't I argue in the same way that the Chalala that marries a Yisraeli, okay, that that if he follows the father, right? What should he become? A Halal? Or does it become a Kohen? especially since we saw a previous Gemara, right, that says what? Chala, that the Benot Yisrael become like a mikvah, a fountain, to a halal, which would seem to tell us that that progeny is going to become a kohen. Okay, right? Particularly if there's no avera, right? Tana koma kom. There, however, it was taught koma kom, which normally the ratio of the first case would therefore normally make us think that they should follow the father, right? La'atuye, but then it would come to exclude, right? Because it said Ezazo. So that would come back to tell us, no, maybe he only becomes a halal and doesn't become a kohen like the father originally was. Ula Rav Dimi, and according to the view of Rav Dimi, Da'amar Sheni Hava, who says Rav Dimi disagrees with Rabba Bar Bar Khan and says, no, in our example of the third generation male Egyptian marrying a second generation female Egyptian.
A second generation Mitzri marries a second generation.
No, that's a second.
That's what he's saying. That's what Rabdimi's saying.
Right.
Because the first one was a second generation male marrying a first generation female.
Okay, so Rav Dimi is saying Sheni Havin. No, that instead
both are second generation.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to get to. Okay, our text from Rabbi Bar Bar Chana was a third generation Egyptian male marrying a second. No, his
second generation male.
Second generation marrying a first generation. So his argument, Rav Dimi's argument, is no, they were both second generation.
That's correct.
He was not second generation and her first, but he was second and she was second. All right? Tana Ezozo, and since it says Ezozo, which is limiting, what happens? Lima ute. We go by the limitation, and therefore that child is only going to be a second generation and not eligible for Kahal Hashem. Okay? So what happens? Vaha Ika. Techiata Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, but when Ravin came, he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Be'umot, okay, halach achar hazachar, namely in the Gentile nations, they follow the yichus of the father. Nitgairu, the person converts, halach achar hapagum shebeshnehem. Then that should be their yichus, should be considered after the more inferior of the two of them. Tana. Why? Because we see that our Mishnah taught Tana, namely Ezazo lemeute, that comes to limit, right? Hi, my. So what's our situation here? Asks the Gemara. I amart b'shleima matnitin Rabbi Yehuda. If we're going to say that our Mishnah is according to Rabbi Yehuda. Kol makom dereisha, when it says every place at the beginning, okay, and that's where it's said in the beginning of not only the first Mishnah, but most of the other parts. La'atuye Yisrael shenasach halala. Okay, that would be including, that would limit a situation of an Israelite marrying a halala. Uda Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Okay, and that would then, we would have to follow the view of Rabba Bar Bar Chana if we were to accept it. Ezazo, but when it says Ezazo, Lema'uti de Rabbi Dimi, Ravin, that would then exclude the view of Rav Dimi and Ravin. Okay, why? Because then we see Kol Makom de Seifa, that later in the later part of the Mishnah. The second example, where there was the Kedushin and an Aveira, okay, La'atuye ger shenasa mamzeret. That would exclude the case of a convert marrying a mamzeret. Ella, rather, I amart Rabbi Yossi. But if you're going to say that our Mishnah is acceptable to the view of Rabbi Yossi, kol makom dereisha k'da'amra, then every kol makom would be inclusive as a cloud, okay, from the first statement in the Mishnah, as we've said. Ezazo, when the Mishnah would then continue with the phrase Ezazo, which we thought, okay, through was going to always be a miut, right? Kidda Amran, also as we said. Ella, but rather, kol makom de sefer, la tuyemai. If that's the case, then in our second example of kedushin and transgression, how are we going to explain the miut there? Okay? Ulata'amech, and furthermore, according to your reasoning there, the Rabbi Yehuda, when regarding the view of Rabbi Yehuda, Ezazo, the Sefer, that statement of the later part of the second example in our Mishnah that seems to be a limitation. Lamali, why do you even need it? Ela aide de Tana Resha, Ezazo, Tana Sefer, Ezazo. Okay. Rather, maybe it was a stylistic issue. And since you wanted to give some examples of the Resha from the Resha, the Kiddushin and valid and no transgression, he wanted to give examples in the Sefer, in the later part of the Mishnah of Kiddushin, where there was a transgression. Okay? All right? Hachanami, here too, Aidi de Tana Resha Komakom, Tananami Sefer Komakom. So therefore, there too, we might argue, come to a conclusion, maybe the structure of the Mishnah was not meant to be klal uprat, but simply a stylistic basis, and to say, I say a general statement, okay, and then I give some, I limit it by some examples, but not all the possible examples that could be. Okay. All right. Now we come back to our text, raising the point that was mentioned earlier. Gufa says, "Ki ata Ravina ma Rabbi Yochanan." What did he say there in terms of the status of non-Jews, the nations? Okay. Now, who do we have to talk about here? Okay, just before we jump back in the text. When it says umot, okay, we could be talking about, I'm going to suggest, two different groups. Group one, okay, I'm going to call umot Eretz Canaan. Okay, those nations, okay, that were there and for whom the Torah has a clear mandated requirement, right? Lo tichyeh kol neshama. They're supposed to blot out all of those particular nations. Okay? On the other hand, you may have group two. Group two are other nations who weren't inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael and for whom the Torah mandate lo tichyeh doesn't apply. Okay? So I'm suggesting there that when it says umot there, it could include either maybe group one or group two, or are they really both the same? Rashi has to deal with this, by the way. Okay? Why? Because Rashi, if you look at the Rashi, just real quick, in the Masoras Hashas, there's a note there, Yabamos. Just above that, there's a Rashi. Minayin la'echad mikol ha'umot. Sheba'olam she'enam min ha'umot shel Eretz Yisrael she'amar hakatuv aleihem lo tichyeh kol neshama. Okay? So it's Rashi who gives us the suggestion that we could be talking about two different groups of umot. Okay, he wants to say that clearly umot here should refer to the non-Canaanite peoples. Okay,
Especially since it's but Canaanite, it says los ischaten bom. You can't marry them
Right.
either.
right. Okay, okay. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's Rashi who makes that clarification for us. Right. So now we can go on. So Gufa, the text says, Ki ata Ravin Umar Rabbi Yochanan, Bu'umot halach achar hazachar. Nitgairu, however, if they've converted, okay, halach achar hapagum shebishnehem. You follow after the inferior of the two of them. Okay, right? So first, we're dealing with a question of, our first question suggested by Rashi is, what about the 7 nations? Our second question is, what about situations of conversion? Let's say, for example, as we're going to jump in a moment, that a Greek person, okay, right, who's certainly not from the 7 nations, marries one of the locals that's a Canaan, from the Canaanite tribes. Okay, would we say then that in that situation that follows the umot, the Greek, and therefore follows the father? Or if would it say it's one of the 7 from one, since she is one of the 7 Canaanite tribes, and she's right?
So then los ichayev on the
Right.
So
So that child would be a Canaanite and not, so to speak, a Greek. Okay, and all the more so, what happens about conversion? So we've got it on the questions on 2 levels. How do we define the yichus of that progeny? And number 2, what's the status were that progeny to consider conversion? Okay, all right, so let's go on now. My be'umot. Okay, what do we mean when we say umot? There, halacha hazachar. When it says that it followed the male, kedetanya, as we learn elsewhere in a Braita, minayim le'achad min ha'umot sheba al ha'kna'anit. How do we know that if one of the, again, example I gave you, Greek or something else, okay, has a relationship with a Canaanite, v'holid ben, and he gives birth to a son, she'atara shai liknoto ba'evid, that you're permitted to buy him as a servant, right? What does that tell us already? It tells us that that's, you follow the umot after the zachar. He's not a Kanani, right, Reuben? He's not going to be considered after the mother. He's going to be considered after the father. Okay? Talmud Lomar, okay? It says, V'gam ibnei hatoshavim hagarim imachem. But we have part of a pasuk that says, also with those inhabitants that dwell among you. Mehem tiknu yechol afet.
Acquire servants.
Right. From them you can acquire servants, right? You can purchase them. Yechol af eved sheba al shifcha min ha'umot. Okay? Right? V'holid ben she'atara shai liknoto ba'eved. Okay? That if a servant, okay, who has a relationship with a female from the other nations, what happens then? And has a son, you can also, all right, purchase him. So that would seem to imply what? That there, in that case, you're following the mother. Talmud Lomar, Asher Holido Ba'artzachem. Therefore, the pasuk refers to the fact that they had to have been born in your land. Min hanoladim ba'artzachem, below min hagarim ba'artzachem. Okay, that they had to have been born in your land and not necessarily simply live in your land. Okay, okay. Now we come to our second issue, which was the Gerus issue. Nitgairu, they converted. Halacha char hapagum shebishnehem. There we said, according to that statement, right, that they follow the inferior or the lesser status of the two of them. B'mai, based on what? Ilema b'mitzri shenasa ammonit. If we're talking about the example of an Egyptian that married a Ammonite, okay? Ammonites were one of the Sheva tribes, right? Sheva nations, right? My pagum ika. What inferior status do we say here? After all, an Egyptian, first and second generation, both are not permitted. So do we say that's a greater, so to speak, pagum?
The Ammonis, a female.
We're gonna we'll get to it, right? Exactly. We're gonna get to it.
Are not allowed, males are not allowed.
Right, we're gonna get to that in a second. Okay, Gemara is gonna bring that in.
That's the worst kasha. What
Right,
pogum is there because as a female.
we'll get, you're right, 100%. I didn't want to jump into that just yet. So I wanted to raise the question, if you've got the Mitzri, that's the male, and the Ammonis, do we say, who do we say has the greater pagum? Okay, so the Gemara asks, wait a second, in that example that you're giving me, if you say the male is the Mitzri, whether he's first or second, and the Ammonis is the female, my pagumika. What pagum do we have in that particular case, right? Why? Ammoni velo Ammonit. It's only the prohibition from the Ammonites is only limited to the male and not to the female. But what about the following? Ela ba'amoni shenasa mitzrit. What about a male Ammonite who marries a female Egyptian? Ve'i zachar, okay, and if it's a male, have hai, shade abatre dide. And were it such, okay, we would have to follow after him, right? Namely the father, right? Ve'im nekeva, and if it's a daughter, what would happen? Okay, hava shadya abatra dida. We would have to follow after her. That's what the Gemara is telling us. All right. So were it to be a male, okay, he would follow under the category of Ammoni, and that would follow, right? Not only couldn't you purchase him as a servant, that follows under Lo Tichya. If it's her, it's a different situation. Into Kahal Hashem, right? Now, Kol she'em la alav kiddushin. What about the fact, the end part of our Mishnah that said there is no kiddushin with a particular person? Mina hani mili. How do we know this? The Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Umatu ba mishum de Rabbi Yana. And what do we say here? Okay, that seems to be derived from a statement of Rabbi Yana. V'rav acha b'rei de Rabba. Okay, and in name of, and also Rav acha b'rei de Rav Rabba. Umatu ba mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And others say it's derived from a statement of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Amar Kra, right? Okay, who says what? Right? There's a pasuk. V'yatsa mi beito, v'alcha v'ayta le'ish acher. Right? The pasuk saying, right, departs from one house, go and marries another or a strange person. La'acherim v'lo lekrovim. We interpreted that to mean to a stranger and not to relations. Matkif la Rabbi Abba. And Rabbi Abba challenges us. Ve'ema, and I would say, la'acher v'lo lebein. Okay, right? It improves, in other words, that refers to the question of the son of the husband as opposed to son of another. Ben behedjikativ, right? But son is specifically written here. Namely, lo yikach ish et eshet aviv acher. Right? We've got that pasuk, right? That clearly spells that out. Lamali, why is that there? Shmamina la'acherim v'lo lekrovim. That teaches us that we have to learn to be able to marry others and not relatives. Ve'ema idi ve'idi lebein. And I might say that both pasukim apply to the question of a son, right? Ha, l'chadchila, v'hadiavad. Okay, one initially and one after the fact. L'chadchila initially, ma'achot isha nafka. Okay, it may be that it's invalid because it comes from the right, right, because most of the prohibitions on erva all are based on the prohibition of achot isha, right? Uma achot isha bikaret, right? Lo tikadesh, with the example of the prohibition of marrying one's wife's sister, the punishment is karet. One is not permitted to betroth. Chai ve'mitot beitin, or the example of those that are right, that the Beis Din has declared them okay guilty of a certain transgression and are punishable by death, right? Lo kol shekain. How much more so? Ema, I might therefore say, aide va'aide bechot isha. Again, coming out of that prohibition of the marrying one's wife's sister. Ha lechatchila, ha diavad. One initially, okay, and one after the fact. And hachinami, okay. We don't seem to have a issue here. Right? Ishkechan achot isha. I find that and I'm aware of the prohibition regarding the sister of a wife. Sha'ar arayot minala. Why? So we have a clear Torah prohibition regarding the karet punishment and the non-marriage to one's wife's sister. What about all the other arayot? Right? Yalfinen me'achot isha. We learn it from the wife sister. Ma'achot isha miyuchedet. Maybe there, since that is a unique situation. Shehi erva, that is a sexual prohibition. V'chayavin as dona kare, and one who does so with purpose in mind is punishable by kare. V'al shigigata chatat, and one who were to do so by accident must bring a chatas. V'lo tafse ba'kedushin, and that betrothal and marriage does not hold, it's not considered valid. Afkol shehi erva. So likewise, any other kind of examples of those erva, sexual relations, marriages that are inappropriate. V'chayavin as dono karet, one then becomes and you transgress, right? Transgress it purposely. One is punishable with karet, vashkigata chatat, and therefore, and by accident, must bring a chatas. Lo tafse ba kedushin. We also say in all of those other examples that the betrothal and marriage don't apply. It doesn't work. So what happens? Bi shlema kulu atyan. That's acceptable. Okay, like we say that all of those are brought together. Ela eshet ish. Okay, but what about the situation of a married woman? Ve'eshet ach, or the situation of a woman married to one's brother. Ikela mifrach. Okay, maybe I might challenge that. Okay, in other words, and say, who's to say that those examples of erva apply to these situations? Ma le'achot isha shekein ein la heter b'makom mitzvah. since we say there that there is no permission, it's not acceptable, okay, for him, okay, in this case of a mitzvah. Tomar be'eshet ach. So also you should say the same thing, okay, with regards to the wife of a brother. Sheyesh la heter b'makom mitzvah. Are we going to say there too that there is a permission there? Okay,
To do the Yavam, mitzvah of Yavam.
right? There's a different situation. Eshet ish nami ikala mifrach. Okay, here too we could challenge the question of a married woman to challenge. Ma lahanach shekain ein la heter b'chaye osran, where there we're saying that there is no permission during the lifetime of the man for whom she is.
While the sister is alive, he cannot
Right, there-
marry the other
Okay,
sister.
I agree with you, but I'm gonna just phrase it a little differently. There is no permission during the lifetime of the one that is prohibited from marrying her, okay? Right, why? Because he's married to her sister. That's the point. Tomar be'eshet ish. Would you say the same thing in regards to a married woman? Sheyesh leheter b'chaye osran. Are you going to say that there's permission to marry her during the lifetime of her one that she's prohibited? In other words, he's prohibited to marry the sister so long as he's married to the sister of that
If the
woman.
husband gives her a get, she's no
Okay.
longer married to him.
Right. So not till the wife would die could he marry the sister. Whereas in this situation, okay, he's only prohibited to marry her because she's an Eshet Ish. But were the husband to give her a divorce, then she would be a Pnuya, she would be available, and somebody else could marry her. That's right. Ella Amar Rabbi Yonah says Rabbi Yonah, V'itema Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yoshua. And others say it was Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi Yoshua. Amar Kra. We have the following pasuk: Kol asher ya'aseh mikol hatoivot ha'ele v'nichratu. Okay. So the pasuk tells us whoever does any of these acts that are abominable, okay, the result is going to be punishment of Koreh. What happened? Hukshu kol ha'arayot kulam la'achot isha. They made an association between all of these other
Arroyos.
relations, okay, to that of the wife's
Achot.
sister. Ma'achot isha lo tafse ba'kedushin. The same way that marrying a wife's sister, that betrothal and marriage is not valid. Af kol arayot kulan lo tafse ba'kedushin. So all these other cases in arayot, that marriage is not valid and takes place. Okay, all right. We could go on, but I think we'll. What?
A couple lines.
Oh, just a couple lines. Ihachi. If that's the case, afilu nida nami. Maybe that should apply to the example of a nida as well. Okay. Right. Alama. Why is that the case? Amar Abaye, hakol modim ba'al hanida va'al hasota she'ena vlad mamzer. But everybody agrees, right, that one who has relations with a nida, okay, or with a sota, the progeny is not considered a mamzer. Right? You've committed an avera, but then the child is not considered a mamzer. Amar chizkia, amar kra, utehi nidata alav, afilu b'sha'at nidata tehei ba havaya. Okay, that even in that case, all right,
She's
the
still
marriage
considered married.
marriage is still tofsin
Right.
in that situation. We'll pick up there tomorrow. Okay.
Work has
It depends on his situation. I know that he has certain health issues that make it uncomfortable for him to. All right. All right. Louvain, you walking?
Yes.
I'll be along. I gotta.
Back to the old, the weather's permitting now.